why are you going through Nehemiah? And I'm going through Nehemiah for a couple of reasons. About 12 years ago, I heard a man named Tim Keller speak for the first time. And he spoke at a pastor's kind of conference banquet, and he spoke from Nehemiah. And I didn't know anything about Nehemiah, and what he said about Nehemiah just really grabbed my heart. And after he spoke on Nehemiah, I remember saying to myself, I want to learn more about Nehemiah. And so that's one of the reasons. The second reason, I do think maybe a lot of you are like me. Maybe you don't know too much about Nehemiah. Maybe you didn't know that Nehemiah existed at all. Maybe some of you knew the name, but you didn't know too much about him. But I just thought it'd be really good for us to look through together the book of Nehemiah. Last week we looked at Nehemiah chapter 1, and it was Nehemiah's prayer to God after he found out that the people of Israel, the people of God, were in trouble and great shame, if you remember. So we took a look at Nehemiah's prayer and what we learned about God through his prayer. And in Nehemiah chapter 2, we are going to see God's answer to Nehemiah's prayer. So Nehemiah chapter 2, verses 1 to 20, this is the word of God. In the month of Nisan, that's about 4 months after Nehemiah prays his prayer in the month of Chislev, if you remember. So in the month of Nisan, in the 20th year of King Artaxerxes, when wine was before him, I, Nehemiah, took up the wine and gave it to the king. So remember that Nehemiah ends chapter 1 with saying, I am cupbearer to the king. Right? So he's just doing his job there. Now I had not been sad in his presence. And the king said to me, why is your face sad, seeing you are not sick? This is nothing but sadness of the heart. Then I was very much afraid. I said to the king, let the king live forever. Why should not my face be sad, when the city, the place of my father's graves, lies in ruins, and its gates have been destroyed by fire? Then the king said to me, what are you requesting? So I prayed to the God of heaven. And I said to the king, if it pleases the king, if your servant has found favor in your sight, that you send me to Judah, to the city of my father's graves, that I may rebuild it. And the king said to me, the queen sitting beside him, how long will you be gone? When you return. So it pleased the king to send me, when I had given him a time. And I said to the king, if it pleases the king, let letters be given me to the governors of the province beyond the river, that they may let me pass through until I come to Judah. And a letter to Asaph, the keeper of the king's forest, that he may give me timber to make beams for the gates of the fortress of the temple, and for the wall of the city, and for the house that I shall occupy. And the king granted me what I asked, for the good hand of my God was upon me. Then I came to the governors of the province beyond the river, and gave them the king's letters. Now the king had sent with me officers of the army with horsemen. But when Sanballat the Horonite and Tobiah the Amorite servant heard this, it displeased them greatly that someone had come to seek the welfare of the people of Israel. So I went to Jerusalem and was there 3 days. Then I arose in the night, I and a few men with me, and I told no one what God had put into my heart to do for Jerusalem. There was no animal with me but the one on which I rode. I went out by night by the valley gate to the dragon spring and to the dung gate, and I inspected the walls of Jerusalem that were broken down and its gates that had been destroyed by fire. Then I went on to the fountain gate and to the king's pool, but there was no room for the animal that was under me to pass. Then I went up in the night by the valley and inspected the wall. And I turned back and entered by the valley gate, and so returned. And the officials did not know where I had gone or what I was doing. And I had not yet told the Jews, the priests, the nobles, the officials, and the rest who were to do the work. Then I said to them, "You see the trouble we are in, how Jerusalem lies in ruins, with its gates burned. Come, let us build the wall of Jerusalem, that we may no longer suffer derision." And I told them of the hand of my God that had been upon me for good, and also of the words that the king had spoken to me. And they said, "Let us rise up and build." So they strengthened their hands for the good work. But when Sanballat the Horonite, and Tobiah the Ammonite servant, and Geshem the Arab heard of it, they jeered at us and despised us and said, "What is this thing that you are doing? Are you rebelling against the king?" And I replied to them, "The God of heaven will make us prosper, and we, his servants, will arise and build. But you have no portion or right or claim in Jerusalem." One thing that I want you to know about Nehemiah, Nehemiah is not one of the minor prophets. There are different genres or types of books in the Old Testament. Old Testament prophets like Jeremiah, Isaiah, minor prophets like Amos. Nehemiah is not one of the minor prophets, and some of you might have thought that he was. Nehemiah is a historical book. It tells of the history of Israel, what God is doing in and through the people of Israel. What I like about Nehemiah, I like that he's really human. And maybe you would say, well, isn't everybody in the Bible human? And it's true, everyone in the Bible is human, but I really like Nehemiah's humanness. He doesn't come off as a great hero. He comes off as a very normal individual. And it's a normal individual that God uses to help his people. And that encourages me. That strengthens me. And we see that in today's passage. I mean, one of the things that we know through Nehemiah is that God cares for his people. I want you to know this, that Nehemiah is not about the person Nehemiah. Nehemiah is about how God uses an individual to bless his people, to bless God's people. The object of God's affection in this passage is not simply Nehemiah, it is God's people. God cares for his people. God's people are in great trouble, we're told. They're in great shame. And God sees his people. God knows his people. God cares about his people. And in order to rescue them from their great trouble and shame, he sends them the leader Nehemiah. And it's through Nehemiah that God brings them out of this trouble. And that sounds very similar to the gospel, right? I want you to remember that this story is very similar to our story, that it reminds us that God, he knows you, that he knows us, that he cares for us. He sees our great trouble. He sees our great shame because of our sin. And he sends to us another leader, the leader. He sends to us Jesus Christ. And it's in and through Jesus Christ that God rescues us from our great trouble and our great shame. So I hope that as we go through Nehemiah, I hope that as you read through it and kind of meditate on it, that you remember that what God does for the people of Israel here in Nehemiah, he does actually in an even greater way for us, his people today, in and through the person of Jesus Christ. As I read through Nehemiah chapter 2, one of the reasons that God was able to use Nehemiah is because Nehemiah was an extraordinary leader. He had great leadership. And I think there's a lot that we can learn about leadership, godly leadership, through Nehemiah. I've said this before, but every year I try to go to 2 conferences. I try to go to a church, a theological, a Bible conference, so I can grow in my knowledge of the Bible. but I also try to go to a conference on leadership. And it's because I think for a lot of leaders, for a lot of people, their limiting factor isn't going to be their ability to teach. It might not be their theology, but your limiting factor may be your leadership, your ability to lead. And I would say that all of you are leaders in one way or another. Some of us may be more obvious leaders, but I would say all of you are leaders one way or another. If you're married and you're a man, you're a leader in your family. If you're a mother, you're a leader to your children. If you're a brother or a sister and you have younger siblings, you may be a leader to them. You may be a leader among your friends. You may be a leader in the youth group. You may be a leader in the children's church. But I would guess that most, if not all of you, in one way or another, have a role of leadership. And I think then the question that you need to ask yourself is, well then, am I being a good leader or am I being a bad leader? Right? Because if you're a leader, then you're exerting leadership. But then the question you need to answer is, well, am I being a good leader or a bad leader? Over the years, as I've thought about my leadership, when I pray for myself as a leader, I pray for 4 things. And it was just kind of amazing that I saw these 4 things in Nehemiah chapter 2. The 4 things that I pray for vision, I pray for wisdom, I pray for faith, and ultimately I pray for obedience. Faith and obedience go together, right? Obedience is the working out of your faith. But when I pray for myself, when I pray for other leaders, I pray for those 4 things: vision, wisdom, faith, and obedience. And if you read other leadership books, you'll see other characteristics, like a leader needs passion, right? A leader needs conviction. Like there's a lot of other things you could probably add to that list, but the 4 things that I pray for normally are these 4 things. And again, I see them in Nehemiah chapter 2. The vision that Nehemiah has is a vision to go back to Judah and to rebuild the walls of Jerusalem. And this isn't a vision that Nehemiah has given to himself. Clearly, Nehemiah tells us that this is what God has placed in his heart. That this is what God has placed in his heart. And I would say that if you're a leader, you can't really lead without vision. Because if you're a leader, you need to be out in front of the people that you lead, right? And you need to know where you're leading them to. And where you're leading them to is that vision that God has given to you. And so I think, again, because you can't give yourself this vision, this is a vision that God has to give to you. It can only come through prayer. And so I would really encourage you that you would pray, God, would you give me vision? Give me vision for my marriage. Give me a vision for my family. Give me a vision for my children. Give me a vision for my job. Give me a vision for my business. Give me a vision for my friendships. But if you're going to lead, you need vision. And I would say that you're really not a leader without vision. One of the things that I pray for when I pray for my children, we pray 2 things that I pray for every night when I pray for my children. One, I pray that God would fill them with His Spirit, because ultimately I know that I can't bring my children to faith in Jesus Christ. Ultimately, I know that's the work of God, the Holy Spirit. And so I pray, God, would you fill my children? Would you fill our children with your Holy Spirit? And then I pray every night, God, would you give them dreams and visions from you? God, would you give them dreams and visions? I hope they have great dreams. I hope they have great visions. But dreams and visions that God has given to them. Nehemiah, he has a God-given dream. He has a God-given vision. And one of the reasons that God is able to use him is because God has given him vision. One of the things that really, the one thing that stuck out to me the most about Nehemiah is at the end of verse 2, he tells us that I was very much afraid. And again, I like that because it tells me that Nehemiah is human. It's like, oh, really? Like, Nehemiah, he's afraid too? Like, because I think we're all afraid at times. You know, in the role of leading, I think there are moments of fear and of being afraid. later we're told that after King Artaxerxes asks him, so what do you want? He says that he prays to the God of heaven. And I think you can kind of read in between the lines there and say again, the reason he's praying is because he's afraid. And it's important that you understand why he's afraid. So Artaxerxes' father was Xerxes the first. And Xerxes the first, he was king of Persia. Okay, so before Artaxerxes. Artaxerxes was not his firstborn son. Artaxerxes was his second son. His first son was Darius. Now, Xerxes, Artaxerxes' father, Xerxes was murdered by his closest counselor. So the person who gave him counsel, a high official, Xerxes was actually killed, murdered by his closest counselor. His name was Artaban. And so when Artaban was questioned about why he murdered Xerxes, he told them that Xerxes' firstborn son Darius had told him to do so. And because of what Artaban said about Darius, Artaxerxes went and killed his older brother, and he took the throne, and he became the king of Persia. Now, Artaban was still alive, and ultimately Artaban wanted the throne of Persia. And so he tried to kill also Artaxerxes, but he was unsuccessful, and Artaxerxes ended up eventually killing Artaban. So when Artaxerxes thinks of the king, when he thinks of the throne of Persia, that's what he thinks of, right? He's always thinking of people who want to take the throne, right? And he needs to constantly be defending his throne. And if you were Artaxerxes, and if you had gone through what he had gone through with his father and his brother, I think you would be a little paranoid too. I think you'd be a little paranoid about if you can trust anybody. Can you even trust your closest counselor? Why? Because it was Xerxes' closest counselor, Artaban, who murdered him. So I think if you're Artaxerxes, I think you're always kind of on guard. You don't know who you can really trust. And maybe you're paranoid. Can I really trust this person? And now Nehemiah, we're told, Nehemiah is cupbearer to the king. And so it's a really important role. It's not like the king can't get his own wine, and that's why Nehemiah has to give him his wine. I'm sure that's part of it, but part of the cupbearer's responsibility is to ensure the king's safety in what he eats and drinks. Okay? And so one of the ways that somebody might want to kill the king is by poisoning his drink. And so at times, the cupbearer will have to drink the wine before the king drinks it, right? To ensure the king's safety. But again, if you're Artaxerxes, even when it comes to Nehemiah, a question that you need to always ask yourself is, can I trust this person? Is this person really loyal to me? And if you kind of read the history of Artaxerxes, there were other people who tried to come against him, and he killed them very quickly. He really had no tolerance for anybody who tried to come up against him. So why is it then that Nehemiah would be very much afraid? That's what we're told. At the end of verse 2, he says, "Then I was very much afraid." Now it's important you see this. In Nehemiah chapter 1, Nehemiah prays. At the end of Nehemiah 1, we see the prayer. The prayer really is, "Give success to your servant and grant him mercy in the sight of the king." Right? That's the prayer. And in Nehemiah chapter 2, we see God answering that prayer. And we're told that Nehemiah doesn't look sad in front of the king. I don't think Nehemiah is trying to set up this situation. Nehemiah doesn't try to, manipulate the king to try to get his way. We're told very clearly, "Now I had not been sad before the king." But even though he didn't try to show his sadness, obviously somehow King Artaxerxes saw his sadness. And so he asks him a question. Why are you sad? You're not sick. This must be sadness of the heart. And right after that, Nehemiah says, I was very much afraid. And this is why he's very much afraid. Because the reason he's sad is he's sad about Jerusalem. Right? He's sad about the people of Israel. But if he says that to King Artaxerxes, Artaxerxes might actually think that he's being unloyal to him, that he's being unfaithful to him, that maybe he cares more about his people, right? Maybe he's going to be faithful to his people and not to me. And if the king gets the sense, even the slightest sense, that Nehemiah, the cupbearer, right, is not loyal to him, that he can't trust him, then it will mean his very life. And so you understand maybe why Artaxerxes is very much afraid. And so he tells them, well, it's because the city of my father's graves, he's very wise about how he goes about it. He says, the city of my father's graves is in ruins. And then the king asks him, what are you requesting? And then again he says, so I prayed to the God of heaven. Again, I think he's scared. I think that's another, it's because I'm scared that he prayed to the God of heaven. And this is when he asks. He said, if it pleases the king, and if your servant has found favor in your sight, send me to Judah, to the city of my father's graves, that I may rebuild it. Now, I know you don't feel the suspense. I can see it in your face. You know the answer, right? There's no suspense in your face. But if you're Nehemiah, you have just made a very bold request. And you don't know, if you're Nehemiah, you don't know what the answer to this request is going to be. And the king's first two words are what? How long? No, we know what he says. He says, how long will you be gone? And when will you return? But again, Nehemiah doesn't know that Artaxerxes is going to say that. If I'm Nehemiah and the first word from the king I heard was how, I would think he's going to say, how dare you? Or, how long? How long have you felt this way? How long have you been unfaithful to me? You know, you're my cupbearer. And that would mean his very life. Again, when Nehemiah waits for the king's response, and we're even told that the queen was sitting beside him, I don't think that Artaxerxes gave him an answer really quickly. I think the fact that we're told that the queen was sitting beside him, it's almost like he was looking to the queen. Maybe they talked about it. And in the end, because the hand of God was upon him, Artaxerxes allows him to go to the city of Judah. One thing that you need to know, one thing I really admire about Nehemiah, Nehemiah is I think he's a normal guy. Nehemiah, he's a government employee, right? And you would say that he's a high-ranking government employee. And definitely that this job that he has as cupbearer to the king, it pays very well. If you keep on reading, Nehemiah is a very wealthy man. It pays very well. And because he has access to the king, it's also a position where it's a position of influence. But one of the things that I really admire about Nehemiah is that he doesn't use his position and his power for himself. Right? He gives it to God. And he allows God to use Nehemiah's position and his influence and ultimately even his wealth to do what God wants him to do. Again, the one word that Nehemiah uses to describe himself the most is your servant. If we learn one thing from Nehemiah, we should learn that we are God's servants. And if you're a servant, you just got to hear this. If you're a servant, you don't get to choose what to obey and what not to obey. If you're a servant, you simply obey whatever it is that your master tells you to do. And so for me, when I felt that God was calling me to pastoral ministry, I'd been praying for a long time, God, I am your servant. But if I really understood what it means to be a servant, you can't really say, well, God, I really don't like that. I'd really rather not do that. I'd rather serve you in a different way. But again, if that's the answer, then you don't really understand the nature of a servant. Because a servant doesn't get to pick and choose what he or she does. A servant simply obeys the master. And Nehemiah, he doesn't hold on to his position and his power and his wealth for himself. He makes it fully available to God. And God uses Nehemiah's position, power, and wealth for God's purpose. The next thing that you see, and I think this is where the wisdom comes into play, he doesn't just ask Artaxerxes to go and rebuild the walls, but then he even goes one step farther, and he says, if it pleases the king, let letters be given me to the governors of the province beyond the river, that they may let me pass through until I come to Judah. And let a letter to Asaph, the keeper of the king's forest, that he may give me timber to make beams for the gates of the fortress of the temple, and for the wall of the city, and for the house that I shall occupy. I mean, that's just wisdom, right? He could have just stopped when the king gave him permission to go to Judah, but God gave him wisdom to know that he needed more than simply the king's permission, that he was going to run into difficulties, and that if he asked this in advance, that it would make his job easier. Now, I don't know about you, but the older that I get, the more I realize how important wisdom is, and the more I realize that I don't have it. And so one of the prayers that I pray for myself is, God, would you give me wisdom even beyond my years? God, would you give me wisdom? Give me wisdom to know how to lead well. And I think that's what Nehemiah has. Nehemiah not only has vision, but God has given Nehemiah great wisdom. And it's because of this vision and wisdom that he's able to lead. The last thing that I see, I'm sure there's other things that you might be able to see, but the last thing that I see that Nehemiah has, and it's what really sets him apart. This last thing, if he doesn't have faith, then the vision and the wisdom don't mean anything. Because God has given him this great vision to rebuild the walls of Jerusalem. And he's even given him the wisdom to know how to do it. But if he doesn't have the faith to do it, then the fear is going to overcome him, right? The fear is going to overcome him, and the fear is going to be ultimately what stops him from doing what God has called him to do. And we see in Nehemiah chapter 1 that he's a man of faith, but we see especially in Nehemiah chapter 2. Again, what you do when you run into difficult times, that's a really good indicator of your character. Pastor Tony today in youth group, he's going to be preaching on James chapter 1. And James chapter 1, it says, consider it all joy, when you experience trials of many kind. And we were talking about this earlier this week, saying that verse always humbles me, because when I experience trials of various kinds, joy is not the first thing that I experience. I complain. I grumble. I think about how can I get out of this? But I don't consider it all joy. But again, it's another example of what you do when you go through difficult times. That's a really good indicator of who you are and of your character. And if you look at Nehemiah, maybe during one of the most difficult times of his life, when his life was in the balance, he was afraid. And I love the fact that he's just honest about it. He's like saying, I'm not a great man. I'm not this great person. I was really afraid. But then what is it that made him, to be able to overcome his fear? Is that he was a man of faith. That he believed. That he believed that God heard his prayer. Right? And he believed that the vision that he had was a vision that God had placed upon his heart. And so what enabled Nehemiah to overcome his fear was the faith that God had given to him. And it's the faith that he has that ultimately, and we see the faith in the obedience, right? In the way that he requests to the king to go to Judah and to the things that the things that he does. Two other things, and we'll wrap it up here. The other thing that is really wise about Nehemiah is he doesn't just take the word of the messengers about the condition of the city gate. He goes out, we're told in great detail that he goes out and he inspects for himself the city gate. He wants to know for himself the condition of the city so that he can address, the people of Israel correctly and properly. The one last thing that you see is I don't think any of us would doubt that Nehemiah is in God's will. That in what Nehemiah is doing here in Nehemiah chapter 2, that he is serving God, that he is doing the will of God. But it's important that you see that just because you're doing the will of God doesn't mean that it's going to be easy. I think some people think, well, if I'm in God's will, then shouldn't my life be easy? Like, shouldn't it be comfortable? Shouldn't everything be good? And I would think that's actually a misperception of what it means to be in God's will. I do think being in God's will means having a peace that surpasses all understanding. I do think that being in God's will means having a joy that is not dependent upon your situations or your circumstances. But that doesn't mean that life is easy. It doesn't mean that life is without problems. It doesn't mean that life isn't difficult. Actually, I think that being in God's will may be more difficult. Choosing God's will may be the more difficult path than the other choice, the other option of not being in God's will, doing what you want to do. And you see that in today's passage. Clearly, the hand of God is upon Nehemiah. Nehemiah himself tells us so. Clearly, Nehemiah is in God's will, and yet he has opposition. Right? He's opposed. And it's a good reminder to us that just because you're in God's will doesn't mean that you're not going to have people that oppose you, right? That you're not going to experience difficulty. And especially when you look at the three characters in today's story that oppose Nehemiah, it's not so much that Nehemiah they oppose, but they don't have any regard for the people of Israel. They're upset that Nehemiah has come to seek the welfare of the people of Israel. We're going to read on here in Nehemiah in the next couple of weeks, but God uses Nehemiah to rescue his people from great trouble and from great shame. And again, one of the reasons that he's able to do so is because of Nehemiah's leadership. Now, ultimately, I started off by saying that, the book of Nehemiah, it's not about Nehemiah. It's about God's people. It's about how God uses Nehemiah for God's people, to rescue God's people, to bless God's people. So I want to end by saying this. We've talked about leadership. We've seen some leadership characteristics, vision, wisdom, and faith and obedience in Nehemiah. But ultimately, I don't want you to think that it's about you. God, make me a great leader. Because if you're not careful, you're going to walk away from here saying, okay, I'm going to be a great leader. But what makes Nehemiah a great leader is that he serves other people. Ultimately, if you want to be a great leader so that you can be a great leader, that's not being a great leader. Great leaders serve. And so I would hope that as you pray for yourself, as you remember how God used people like Nehemiah, how God used the person of Jesus Christ himself, that as you pray for yourself, God, would you give me vision? God, would you give me wisdom? God, would you give me faith? God, give me obedience. But you would say, God, so that I might serve your people. So that, God, that I might serve you. So that, God, so that you could use me. We pray it every Sunday that, God, that in and through my life, God, hallowed be your name. Your kingdom come. God, your will be done on earth, in our life, in Sayan English Ministry, as it is in heaven. Would you pray with me as we close today? We'll take a minute to respond to God, to His word in prayer.